Stories from Real Life is sponsored by Forever, the digital shareable platform that preserves all of your precious memories forever.
This is Melvin E. Edwards, the host of Stories from Real Life. One of the things I'm passionate about when I'm not doing this podcast is genealogy. And if you've ever researched ancestors, you begin to understand how short generations really are. That's why it's important to preserve those memories while you still have the chance. And that's where Forever comes in. Forever is the world's first permanent, shareable digital home for all your memories. Look, your photos, videos, and family stories deserve more than temporary cloud storage. With a Forever storage account, your files are guaranteed safe and protected for your lifetime plus 100 years. Your lifetime plus 100 years. And here's what I love. No endless monthly fees. You can make a one-time payment or break it down to 24 monthly installments and you own your storage. It's all backed by the Forever Guarantee Fund, built to preserve your legacy for generations. Check out my website, podcastreallife.com, and click on sponsors or the link in the show notes. Your memories are the stories from your real life. Forever makes sure they truly last forever.
Today on Stories from Real Life, we're talking about something most of us don't get enough of and rarely think deeply about: sleep. My guest is Dr. Ben Long, known as the Wholehearted MD. He's a physician, sleep specialist, educator, and writer who explores the intersection of medicine, faith, and human flourishing. Ben challenges the idea that rest is a reward for productivity and instead invites us to see sleep as a biological necessity and a moral and spiritual one. This is a conversation about burnout, vocation, insomnia, medical culture, and what happens when we treat rest not as weakness, but as wisdom. This is Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, and today's story is Dr. Benjamin Long's The Quiet Cost of Exhaustion.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining me for the podcast where our personal stories remind us how much we can learn from each other. On today's episode, we're talking about something most of us don't get enough of. We talk about it a lot, but we don't actually seem to get enough of it, and that's sleep. So my guest is Dr. Benjamin Long, known as the Wholehearted MD. He's a physician, sleep specialist, educator, and writer who explores the intersection of medicine, faith, and human flourishing. He challenges the idea that rest is a reward for productivity and instead invites us to see sleep as a biological necessity and a moral and spiritual one. So, Dr. Long, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me on. I'm super excited for this conversation.
So, as we begin, let's establish some terms so that we can have a foundation for this discussion. So, first of all, explain what insomnia is and what causes it.
Absolutely. I've found that a lot of people might have several different pictures of insomnia in their mind. And usually that's kind of more on the, far end, someone who, only sleeps like 1 hour or something like that, and, has all this other kind of mental health stuff going on. But really the diagnosis of insomnia is that if you are having a significant difficulty either falling asleep or maintaining sleep, so most of the time we kind of cut that off at about 30 minutes to fall asleep. And then it's also a matter of how it is impacting you as well and how frequently it's happening. So, if you get the Sunday scaries, you hate your job and you're just like, I've got to go back. But then all that stress comes back and then you have a difficult night on Sunday night. But Monday, you're able to get up and go through the rest of your week and you don't really have too much of an issue. We wouldn't necessarily say that that is insomnia from a clinical diagnosis perspective. But really, if it's that I have frequent difficulty over multiple nights. Or let's say that you have those Sunday scaries, but it's like, I don't sleep at all Sunday night, and that really impacts my work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then that would be something that we would put into that insomnia bucket. So it's a really large kind of umbrella term for insomnia. And of course, the insomnia from a child who doesn't have the limit set by their parents. And so they keep on coming out of their bedroom saying, I want another story. I want another this or that kind of a thing. That's one kind of insomnia versus the person who, can't calm their mind down to think about it. It's the same phenomenon in that we're not getting the sleep that we need, but the root causes are going to be different.
Okay. So as I mentioned in the intro, you describe sleep as a biological necessity and also a theological gift. So can you explain that to us?
Absolutely. In my own medical education and training, I did a year-long fellowship in sleep medicine, and so learned everything that I could about sleep science at that time. And what I found was that we do a really good job of talking about sleep from the perspective of, I know what's going on in your brain and the brain waves. I can classify it, I can categorize it, and then I can also look at barriers to good sleep and then treatment and management of those things. And yet on the patient care side, when I'm walking with people in their experiences of the sleepless night, then I noticed that inevitably we would get to a point on the journey where maybe I had tried all of the tools in my toolbox, but still their sleep wasn't better. And I kind of just wondered, is there something else that I'm missing? Is there something else that I could, bring to help these people with their sleep? And so part of that, as well as my own kind of journey and attempt to bring together my faith as well as my practice in medicine and have that more integrated, led me to looking at the Bible to see, what does the Bible have to say about sleep? Turns out it's a lot. So from what I have found in my exploration is more of a narrative of who we are in the world as humans in relation to a creator God. My creatureliness, my limitations, my need for sleep is in contrast to God, who doesn't need to sleep, is creator, is sustainer over all things. And so that belief is very different from the belief that all there is just what I can see, feel, and touch, and anything with my senses. And when I can't sleep, it's just something that's going on in my brain, and I need to, do whatever behaviors or thoughts or therapy to be able to overcome this so I can get the sleep that I need. Those are two different narratives. And I found that there's something, for me at least, more deeper and fulfilling in that Christian narrative.
Okay, so what are some of the most persistent myths about sleep in medicine and popular culture?
I think a popular one is that kind of biohacking, I'll sleep when I'm dead, I don't need to sleep, or especially in certain kind of work environments, there's this idea that I can train myself to sleep well. I was just reading an excerpt from, I believe it was Plato's Laws, and he's talking about the Persians and how as a race, he has this kind of like quick line that it's like, oh, they are able to train themselves to go without sleep. So even as far back as like Plato, there is this idea that somehow we can work ourselves into being better at being sleep deprived. And reality is that everyone's going to have certain levels of vulnerability to sleep deprivation. Some people are going to be impacted by it way more than others. So there is a certain individuality in that. However sleep deprivation impacts you, you're not going to get better at being sleep deprived. I tell people it's kind of like saying, I'm going to get better at driving while drunk. All I have to do is just practice drunk driving, if I could just practice it and do it enough, I can figure out how I could actually drive drunk and be a good driver. Like, no one says that. We have created laws to be able to say that's not smart, that's not possible. And yet, on the flip side, with sleep, there is still, in some pockets, in some places, this idea that you can be sleep deprived and train yourself to be better at being sleep deprived.
Okay. So what's the difference between insomnia and sleep apnea?
So sleep apnea is a diagnosis that is fragmenting your sleep. So naturally, when you are falling asleep, if you think about your airway, you've got like your windpipe, you have your tongue, you have the muscles that are kind of controlling everything in there. All of that is going to be slightly dynamic as you're going through the different stages of sleep, and it's going to relax. And so if you think about sleep apnea on a spectrum, if my windpipe and everything is totally open as I'm breathing, that's optimal. Versus sleep apnea is when there is some kind of obstruction that is from one of those kind of structures in your windpipe, in your tongue, and in your upper airway that is going to cause a block so that way you can't breathe. And then there's going to be a continuum of something in the middle. So just snoring is coming from, there's some kind of narrowing, whether that's in your nasal passages, your airway, or something that is slightly getting more narrow and so causing you to snore. So everyone is going to have occasional pauses in their sleep. That's a common conversation I have, especially with parents. And they're like, oh my gosh, my baby, I was watching them and then they stopped breathing and then they started breathing again, but it's just freaking me out. Do they have sleep apnea? And, my answer is usually like, well, maybe. We have to see. But one thing that we can be reassuring is that all people will have an occasional pause in their breathing, and that's okay. And our body is able to respond to that and overcome that, and that's okay. It's if it is so frequent that it is fragmenting your sleep. So for adults, typically, if you are having a pause in breathing at least 5 times per hour, especially if you're having some kind of impact on your daily life. So if you're having significant daytime sleepiness, then we would make that diagnosis of sleep apnea. And then for adults, we say if you're doing it at least 15 times an hour, that's moderate sleep apnea, and 30 times an hour is severe sleep apnea. But when we say mild, moderate, severe, that doesn't necessarily always relate to the severity of symptoms. I can have people who they pause and breathe in 6 times an hour and they're just devastated and they feel exhausted and just can't sleep at all, or feel like they can't function during their day. Versus I have guys who are like 90 times an hour and they're like, yeah, I guess I feel a little sleepy in the morning, kind of a thing. Like it's inevitably those are the guys who are like, I'm just here because my wife says I snore, and they're not as concerned. And on the flip side, me seeing that 90 per hour and then kind of going through their history, I'm like, no, we really need to get on top of this for you because this could be really bad for your health. So sleep apnea is one of those things too that can be something that fragments your sleep that actually is a root cause of your insomnia. So a story that we will hear is someone who comes in because they have difficulty maintaining their sleep. So they might be able to fall asleep pretty quickly, but they're like, I wake up so much and I have difficulty kind of falling back asleep. And sometimes you can think of it as just like sleep apnea is kind of like perturbing the system. Like it's fragmenting it and making it difficult for you to consolidate your sleep and to stay asleep, essentially.
Okay, so I mentioned before we started this interview that my wife had some questions that she wanted me to ask you, and snoring was one of them. But for me, I never have a problem going to sleep, no matter what. I can be asleep in a minute or two, but I oftentimes have trouble staying asleep. But lately, I've been working on a novel that I'm writing, and my peak creativity time seems to be between 3 a.m. and 8 a.m. So is something like that typical?
Yeah, I think I don't have a research study off the top of my head for that, but I do think there is something about the creativity of the mind in those kind of quiet hours, whether that's late evening or early morning. We know, what I can say is we know that there are certain changes in the brain and changes in the mind. Most of that research is looking at people with significant depression or suicidality risk or things of that nature, and kind of saying, hey, maybe just being awake at night might be an independent kind of risk factor for your mental health, because in some ways, like, we are supposed to be asleep. And so there are certain changes that are happening in our brain that might make us more impulsive or more, or I guess less responsive to the reward system in our brains, or certain things that could impact our impulsivity or our behaviors and actions we're going to take overnight. So I think there's something there to say there are certain changes in the mind that are happening overnight. And definitely I hear from people who, instead of being like worriers for insomnia, they're like the quote unquote overactive imagination. I have, people who are trying to exactly write novels or stuff like that. And they're like, I just get all these ideas in the middle of the night. And I start just like thinking about my book and thinking about this stuff and just like following that at some level too. And so, I would say definitely it is a narrative that I hear from my patients intermittently. So I don't know if your wife is trying to say there's something wrong with you, but
she thinks I'm not getting enough sleep. That's what.
Oh, okay. Because you kind of wake up and then you're like, oh, I've got this idea.
I've got it. Yeah, I go to bed pretty early. Well, almost always before 10. And when my ideas start in the middle of the night, I've learned that I have to write them down at that moment, because I've tried before. Like I'll remember this. There's no way I'm going to forget this, and then I'll write it down when I get up, and it's always gone when I get up. So when the ideas start, I've learned that I've just got to do it then, or else I may never have that same word pattern again. So.
Yeah, and I will say that we know. So in the first half of your night, when we're talking about sleep stages, it's more, you have more deep sleep in the first half of the night. So your listeners aren't familiar, you have 4 stages of sleep: non-REM 1, 2, and 3. So 1 is very brief. It's just as you're transitioning to sleep. 2 is kind of where we spend most of the night. And then 3, we dip down into that. And you'll often hear that called slow wave sleep or deep sleep. And I tell people you can think of that as being very restorative for your body. And then the 4th stage is REM sleep, where we typically think about dreaming. And you can think of that as being restorative for your mind. I always caveat this with saying all stages of sleep and all of our sleep is important for both our body and our mind. But we know that there is a certain level of parasympathetic predominance, meaning that part of our nervous system that's resting and digesting is very strong in deep sleep. And then the sympathetic, the fight or flight, is more predominant in REM sleep. So that deep sleep is more predominant in the first half of the night. And then in the second half of the night, you tend to get more REM sleep. And as you're going through successive stages of REM sleep, from what we have in dream research, it tends to be, you tend to get more abstract and more, just kind of far-fetched with some of your dreams as you're going through kind of REM cycles in general. And we know that REM is very important for memory consolidation, for learning, and for all these, faculties of the mind. And so all that to say, you hear stories from creatives, like, especially very prominent in musicians. They might like wake up hearing some kind of tune and then having to write that down. So I think that's very natural in that second half of the night when you're in that REM sleep, and then you wake up and you start getting those kind of ideas. So I would go back to whatever it is, most adults need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep. There are some true short sleepers who need 6 hours and some long sleepers who need 10 or 11 hours. But in general, most people are really in that 7 to 9 hour bucket. So, if in general you are getting inspired but you've had about 7 hours of sleep, then I'm like, go for it, especially if you're not having any problems during the day.
Well, I've learned I can function on about 4.5 hours of sleep, but I'm not at my peak during the day. So it's funny that and I'll make this quick, and then we'll go back to your conversation. So my peak creative hours are between, this has taken me a lifetime to figure out this pattern. My peak creative hours are between 3 and 8 a.m. And then when I'm doing that, my least creative hours are between 3 and 8 p.m.
Okay,
So
interesting.
I don't know what that all means, but it's been something that I've noticed over the course of my life.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's get back to the question for you. So you've talked about sleep being a gift from God. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that actually comes from a direct verse in the Bible, Psalm 127:2. And the end of that, it says, "For he gives to his beloved sleep." And how that psalm is phrased, it does seem to be like it's talking about two different gifts in the chapter. Right after that is a very common one that talks about children are a reward or a gift from the Lord. And that's a very famous verse talking about your quiver being full of arrows. So if you ever hear that saying, it comes from that psalm. But at the core, oftentimes with Hebrew literature, the middle of the poem or the middle of the psalm is really important to the text. And so at the very middle of that, you see these two gifts of children and sleep. And so it comes in this setting of other stuff that's going on in the psalm. So it talks about, the person who is building their house or the watchman who's watching for the safety of the city. And the psalm essentially says, unless God is the one who is building your house, or unless God is the one who is watching over you, then the things you're doing are in vain. And so it goes into this discussion of it's in vain if you rise up early and go late to rest. And I really love one translation that says, that you're going to be eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. And so it's very, applicable to our society today. And that how many times do we say, well, I got to get up early to do this, or I got to stay up to do that. And it's this kind of mindset flip to say, no, there's an illusion of control there, and you're not realizing that God is the one that is sustaining and creating all things. Does that mean that I can just be like, okay, cool, God's got this piece out, I'm not going to do anything? Like, obviously, no, you have to collaborate, you participate in life. But we have to recognize that we have our creaturely limitations. And beyond that, that sleep is this gift that God has given us in creation to be able to live the flourishing life that he has for us.
Okay. Well, this is a term that some people are probably familiar with. And I've said that if I ever started a band, which I don't think I will, but if I ever started a band, this is what I would call it: circadian rhythms. So can you
love that.
Can you tell us what circadian rhythms are?
Yeah. So if you think about what is it that regulates my sleep, like everyone sleeps, but we don't really think about like, what is the process behind me like driving myself to sleep? I think most people pretty intuitively understand sleep pressure. We know that from the moment that you wake up and the longer that you're awake, your sleep pressure, or sometimes called process S by sleep doctors, is building until you fall asleep, and that starts to kind of come down. You can roughly think about this as the buildup of adenosine in your brain. Adenosine, if you remember back in your high school biology class, you might remember that your cells with energy need ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so as your cells are using energy, you're taking these three adenosines off of this phosphate, and that's using the energy. So that adenosine that's building up, your body has to do something with it. And so then one of those processes that are relevant to sleep is talking about adenosine that's building up in the different cells in your brain. It's really, again, I always say this, like it's more complex than that, but that's like a simple way that we can think about it functionally. And then the other process that you're just talking about is your circadian rhythm. And this one is a little bit less intuitive, but it's a waxing and waning pattern that you can think of as an activating rhythm. And so I tell people, if you think about a time where you have been awake for over 24 hours, you might notice that the mid-morning the next day, all of a sudden you either get a burst of energy, or maybe you just all of a sudden are not as tired as you once were, which logically doesn't seem to make sense, because you're like, I've been awake for 24 hours. Why would I be, more awake right now. And that's your circadian rhythm. It is this activating rhythm that your body's, in a way, is kind of like trained to be awake at that period of the day. And we know that it's slightly different depending upon the person. So some people you might hear are night owls, some people are morning larks, someone is kind of somewhere in the middle. And so we know that that is different for each person, but your circadian rhythm, all parts of your body are going to actually have a little bit of a rhythmic pattern in how active they are. And so it's interesting as you look into the circadian research to see, there are things like your heart rate. Like there's a study that was done that I was like, man, I would have never signed up for this study. Essentially, someone had to just lay in a bed and not move for like over 24 hours. And that's just like all they did. So, which is like, that sounds great, but then having to be awake and then just stare at the ceiling, or whatever they had to do, like, that sounds like torture. But what they were looking for was trying to allow people to fall asleep and have people to stay awake. And they looked at their heart rate and their blood pressure to see if there was any change depending upon whether or not they fell asleep. So blood pressure from that research and other research has shown that it's very sleep dependent. When you fall asleep, your blood pressure naturally dips. But then those people who stayed awake, their blood pressure didn't really dip to the same extent. So we thought that that's more sleep dependent. What was interesting though is heart rate had a variability to it that whether you were awake or asleep, there was a noticeable dip in your heart rate overnight. And so that is the circadian rhythm, that you're even at the level of your heart and the rate that it beats is going to have that 24-hour waxing and waning pattern.
Okay. So talking about being awake for 24 hours, you've worked with medical trainees who are often awake for very long stretches. So how does sleep deprivation affect their training as a clinician?
Yeah, this is definitely a hot topic in medical education. From I think it was in the 1980s that the Libby Zion case where a patient passed away, and in the investigation of that, one thing that was noted was the sleep deprivation of the residents. And that, amongst other things, led to, whereas previously there were no work hour restrictions on physicians, now there is a cap for you're supposed to not go beyond, I think it's 90 hours a week. So still a really rigorous, demand, but supposed to kind of create that space for people to be able to sleep. And so the more and more that we've done research on sleep deprivation, we know that sleep deprivation leads to changes in the brain where you're going to be, more driven by emotion, more impulsive, in some ways more biased in your perception as well. Kind of going back to that, drunk analogy, you don't rely on a drunk person to tell them whether or not they are drunk. Like you're not going to be able to perceive that. In the same way, it is very difficult for many people to perceive the level of their sleepiness or the level of their sleepiness as well. And so you're going to be more biased at your accuracy and ability to perceive when you are sleep deprived. So all very concerning things if I am your doctor trying to take care of you in the middle of the night, kind of a thing. So it is, I think, something that there is continued talks and still trying to move at better enforcement of restrictions so that people are able to get their sleep. And it's kind of crazy that you look at like the airline industry and you have crew rest and very specific things so people are able to get the sleep that they need to perform. And yet, like I just said, a surgeon who is about to take out your gallbladder in the middle of the night, no one is necessarily saying like, wait, how much sleep did you get before, like trying to take out my gallbladder, kind of a thing.
Okay. So as a Christian physician, have you ever felt any tension between religion and science?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think personally, I felt a big tension as I entered into my medical education because I came from a perspective that science and medicine and religion are necessarily antagonistic, and a way of thinking, you know, you don't have to be in medical education very long to realize that there is a narrative around religion that it is going to be oppressive or inhibiting for your health. A very common thing, like if you talk to probably any doctor or medical trainee and think about a case scenario, so a fictitious scenario with a patient of how faith is going to impact their medical care, I can almost guarantee you that most of them are going to think of a Jehovah's Witness refusing a blood transfusion, because it is like the go-to case scenario of discussing in like a medical ethics class that intersection of religion and faith. The I guess ironic part there is that much of the religion and health research has actually found that religion is a positive force for health in a lot of markers. One of the strongest evidence that we have for that comes from a cohort of nurses that have been followed over years and years and years. And when they've looked at different variables for just years for these nurses to stay alive, one of the strongest variables for that was religious service attendance. And so a lot of people, there's a discussion when you're talking about religious variables that they are like, well, that's just because this person is sociologically embedded in a community and they're not isolated. And so that's going to be the main thing that is helping their health, which is a fair critique, certainly. But if there is this strong influence of like religion as being good for your health, it's just very interesting that in general, probably you have rarely been to a doctor who asks you about your spirituality or religion outside of maybe a one-liner question of like, oh, is your religion going to impact your healthcare? And you just like circle yes or no kind of a thing. But then I think in a broader picture too, we do have a very antagonistic view of science and faith, and that they are, butting heads all the time. And as a Christian, the model of integration that I probably fall under is looking at God as the creator of two books. We have God as he has revealed himself in the Bible. And so that's going to be asking certain questions about God that are not answerable by science, such as who is God? Why are we here? How did we get here? I guess you could argue maybe science tries to ask that, how did we get here? One that's definitely a popular discussion. But why are humans the way that they are? And if there is a God, then who is he and what are the characteristics of that God? So those are questions that the Bible is answering for us versus the book of creation, where God has created a whole world, and if he has created us as well, and so our creation is coming from the same source, then that does give us a better, I guess, worldview understanding to say, I can actually look at all of this stuff that God has also created, and I can explore it and learn from it. And there's something there for me to discover, because if God has created too, then it's going to say something about God. Just as a potter who makes a pot, the way that they make their pot and their final product is going to say something of them, the same thing for creation. And so people who hold more of those two books of creation underneath one God, then it's like those two things are not going to directly contradict each other. And so really what happens is that a lot of the times the tensions and the fights and the stuff like that seem to be misunderstandings. And it's I think more beneficial to talk about, what are we actually trying to say and how are these two things actually overlapping? And unfortunately, a lot of times we're not able to have those conversations on a very large level, but on a very personal level, in my tiny little niche of sleep and the Bible, I found that there is a beautiful overlap between the two, and there's a conversation that can be had between the two disciplines.
So how do you counsel patients or clinicians who feel guilty about prioritizing sleep over what they would call productivity?
Yeah, I think one, if we are, going back to a Christian worldview, Christian foundation, then going back to that Psalm that we've already talked about of thinking about sleep as a gift. So often I hear patients say, well, if I can't sleep, I might as well be productive. And I think most of us just like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But the decisions that we make are usually indicative of the desires within our hearts. So, not to say that it is evil to fold socks when you can't fall asleep. That's crazy. But to say if you can't enter into rest because you have placed such a high value on productivity and efficiency, then that's something that you as a person need to confront, because then that whatever it is that you are putting your ultimate desires upon, that is going to be forming you as a person. And so if I'm a person who values productivity and efficiency, what am I sacrificing in the pursuit of those things? Or another way you can think about it is, what am I missing? So in the sleepless night, I often will say people are missing that opportunity for connection with God, because so many times the sleepless night is a byproduct of I am so busy in my day and I have no margin and I'm just going from the minute I get up to the minute I'm trying to fall asleep. And I think that can lead to a lot of the issues with just having the difficulty with quieting the mind, because it is the one time in your waking life that you are not either having a screen in front of you or thinking about, something. So your mind is free to be able to start processing all these thoughts and feelings and stressors from your day. And so, in the Christian walk, I, tell people all of life is the spiritual life. It doesn't stop the minute that you try to lay down. So when you can't fall asleep and you're facing sleeplessness, then trying to connect with God is going to form you into a certain kind of person, versus if I'm, choosing to not go to sleep or choosing to be efficient or choosing to do those things, that's forming me into another kind of person. So I probably would say if I'm having that conversation with you, I would just lay out, we got two kind of different paths that you can take, and which one is the one that you really want to walk? Or maybe there's a third path and I don't know. But that's a conversation.
All right, so this seems like a good time to introduce your book. So tell us about the new book you've written.
Yeah, so I wrote a book called Sleep Habits Journal, Practices, Prayers, and Devotions to Ease Your Sleepless Night. And it really came out of this exploration of sleep in the Bible and serving my patients as well, and trying to find a way to explore this overlap that I was seeing between my practice as a sleep medicine physician and the theology that I was exploring in the Bible. And so the book is for people who are experiencing difficulty with their sleep, specifically insomnia and falling asleep. And it's centered around what I call the sleepless night rules. They will sound really familiar if you've ever gone through cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. There's a therapy called stimulus control or stimulus control instructions that these are kind of based off of. So the 5 sleepless night rules, if you can't sleep, you can always come back to them, are 1, cease before bed and wait to feel sleepy. 2, rise from bed if you can't fall asleep. 3, connect with God and wait to feel sleepy. 4, lie down again, and then if you can't fall asleep, repeat steps 2 and 3 until you do fall asleep. And then 5, resist sleeping in and taking naps. And so those sound like pretty straightforward and easy, but as most of us probably know by now, knowing something versus behavior change to implement them are two very different things. And so the book is centered around those 5 rules, so that way you can dive into whichever part of the rules you're having difficulty with. So if you are particularly having difficulty with resisting sleeping in and taking naps, you're like, Ben, I love my naps. Don't take my naps away from me. Then I'm like, hey, I say resist for a reason. I don't say destroy or something like that. So you can go to that section and I can kind of walk you through, well, what are some things that you can do to maybe try to maybe take a short nap that's not going to impact your insomnia. I like to say that it's the insomnia book for people who hate to read. Instead of, like reading a whole chapter and then you have questions at the end, each chapter is full of bite-sized little activities that are in one way or another designed to move you toward that rule and better mastery of that rule by the end of that chapter. And the nice thing about the journal, you write in it, and as you are going on your journey and growing on your journey, the journal is coming with you as well. And so there's space in it for you to put down that book, and then you can not do it for however long of a time because life gets in the way, and then pick it back up. And then it's not like a chapter book where you're like, wait, what chapter was I on? Or you start reading it and you're like, what is this even talking about here? Because it is accessible in that way, you can just like jump back in and you're like, oh, right, the sleepless night rules. I'm going to have trouble with this section. Let me go over here. And then it also has like an index in the back of the book that can be kind of really helpful by life situation too. If you're like, man, I just need some joy, I just need some comfort, I just need some peace, then I try to kind of pull out, hey, maybe these activities might be beneficial for you. Or maybe you're the person, you're like, hey, I'm finally ready. I'm ready for a challenge. I have a whole section that's like, if you're ready to grow, you're ready to push, these are the activities that you need to jump to. So I tried to make it very flexible so that people could encounter the journal in whatever way that fits best into their life, and then really make it practical to actually have those tips, the education, and really make it concrete for people to be able to implement as well.
All right. So how can some sleep interventions unintentionally reinforce anxiety about sleep?
Ooh, that's a great question. Is there anything behind that question or any further thoughts? I haven't been asked that before.
No. I think it goes back to people who feel guilty that they're not being productive if they're asleep.
Yeah, I think for anxiety and maybe reinforcing some things, I try to not say I'm going to give you better sleep very frequently. I will typically say, I'm going to give you better sleep habits. I'm going to walk with you on this journey. But people's lives are so varied and there can be so many different stressors and life circumstances and what's going on that I try to very rarely promise better sleep. I promise that there's going to be growth and it's going to change. And often people are more satisfied. But the sleepless night journey is not linear. It is often 3 steps forward and like 6 steps back kind of a thing. And it varies, some people are able to implement the rules and they just like take off and they're like, man, things are amazing. And then there are some people who it just feels like it's an inch by inch by inch kind of growth. So I really tried to have that in mind as I was writing the book. But there are things that I think one thing the sleepless night is, it's often revelatory in that I'm going to be confronted with a lot about myself that it's really easy for me to distract myself during my day with, if, I kind of relate it to the spiritual practice of fasting. I think most people probably hear fasting from an exercise health benefit as one side of thing, but before it was trendy for that, fasting has been a long spiritual practice within not only Christianity, but many religions. And the one thing that fasting does is it kind of holds up a mirror to who you truly are at your core. Because I can think of myself as been, a fun-loving, lighthearted, and likable guy. But you take away my food for 8 hours or something like that, then I'm a very different person. And we like to think of ourselves as, well, the real Ben, the real me is not hangry Ben. The real me is the Ben with food. Whereas Christianity puts a little bit of a flip on that to say, no, the real you is the hangry Ben. And so what do you do when you are hangry? And so when we've talked a lot about sleep deprivation, you can't improve your ability to perform sleep deprived. One thing that I think we can do in our sleep deprivation is continue to realize spiritually who I am when I am sleep deprived. And so oftentimes you're going to be more, confronted with my pride, my anger, my lust, my, whatever it may be. And so I think that is what I'm thinking about more now as people are engaging this journey into sleepless night is medicine does a really good job of trying to create a pathway of like, okay, here's this intervention just to get you back to sleep. But we're not necessarily talking about what is happening to you as far as within your spirit, your will, your desires, your soul, or anything of that nature when we're giving you that therapy.
Okay, and I just have one question left today, so we start to wind down the conversation. So for listeners who want to take a holistic approach to better sleep, including spiritually, psychologically, physiologically, what's one practice you would recommend as a starting point?
I think depending upon how familiar you are with the Christian faith or what faith tradition you kind of come from, there can be a lot of different forms of prayer that are talked about. And prayer tends to be one of the spiritual practices that are, I think, most discussed, and at least from my background, more of an evangelical kind of background. But especially pre-written prayer, I have found really beneficial. Some people might know that as like liturgy, but having a prayer that I come back to when I am exhausted and tired, because I don't feel like praying or talking to God or doing anything like that. I think in one way, that can be really beneficial for you, for just like writing down a prayer for when you are stopping from your day and ceasing from your day, a prayer for when you know you need to rise out of bed, but you can't, a prayer for when you are waiting to feel sleepy, but sleep is not coming. And I think in another sense too, what that prayer does is not only is this communication with God, which I try to really talk to people about, that it's communication and not manipulation. There's nothing magical that is happening by trying to engage in prayer for your sleep. But I think in one way too is that it also kind of just distracts us mentally from our problem. And in a lot of ways, especially for people who have more of a little bit of a anxiety around bedtime or worries or performance anxiety, then that distraction is really beneficial for them to create a pathway back to sleep. So I think one real simple thing that you could do is just finding pathways to connect with God, whatever that might be for you in your life circumstance.
That sounds like the perfect way to wind down this episode. So my guest today has been Dr. Benjamin Long. Dr. Long, thanks so much for spending time with me today.
This was a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. And I will include your links in the show notes so people can find out how to get your book or maybe set up an appointment with you if they're in the San Antonio area. So if this episode resonated with you, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect, not just on how much sleep you're getting, but on what your life is asking. You can learn more about Dr. Ben Long and his work at the Wholehearted MD. And as always, you'll find this episode and more at podcastreallife.com. This is Stories from Real Life. Until next time, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.